Welcome to Silent Graveyard Whisperer, where we dive into the darkest corners of the unknown, unraveling stories that will haunt your mind long after the screen goes dark. If you love tales of suspense, twisted mysteries, and spine-chilling horror, then you've come to the right place. Grab a seat, turn down the lights, prepare yourself for a journey like no other, because once you step into our world, there's no turning back. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on the next terrifying story we have in store for you. What if the darkness you fear isn't lurking in the shadows, but buried deep within your soul? When Sophia brings home an ancient book from a Tokyo flea market, she unknowingly unleashes a curse that twists her family's fears into reality. As the sinister force grows stronger, the line between their own inner demons and the entity's evil begins to blur. There's no escaping it, because the darkness has already claimed them. The wind whispered through the trees like a voice lost in the mountain's throat, a soft, eerie hum that seemed to carry with it the weight of something ancient. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a crescent moon that cast a cold, silver light over the dense forest. A faint mist clung to the trees, creeping through the underbrush like fingers reaching out from the earth itself. Sophia and her family had only just arrived at their new home, an old, isolated house nestled at the foot of the mountain in the northern reaches of America. It was an area few had heard of, let alone visited. The nearest town was a handful of miles away, its few scattered homes dwarfed by the towering peaks that surrounded them on all sides. The land felt untouched by time, the kind of place people had forgotten. The very air seemed thick, saturated with something that made it feel as though the earth was holding its breath. The house they had chosen was old, worn. It had a quiet presence, as though it had been standing there for centuries, watching the world move on without it. The walls were weathered and cracked, the paint peeling from the windows like skin shedding off a neglected body. The floors groaned underfoot, and the ceilings sagged slightly in the corners as if the house itself was tired. Yet, it had its charm, the kind of rustic appeal that made it feel like a retreat from the busy world, a place to slow down, to breathe, to heal. But there was something about the place that unsettled Sophia. It was subtle, something she couldn't quite put into words. Yet the longer she spent there, the stronger the feeling became. Every night, the darkness seemed deeper. The silence seemed more oppressive. The forest beyond their property, endless and dark, felt like it was watching them, waiting. No birds sang in the daytime. No critters rustled in the underbrush. The land was quiet. Too quiet. Sophia sat by the window on the first night they spent in the house, staring out into the forest as the wind howled through the trees. The view was beautiful, almost serene. The mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks sharp against the night sky, shrouded in mist. The world outside was swallowed by shadows, the trees swaying as though they were alive, stretching out towards the house, reaching, yearning. Her thoughts drifted back to the trip they'd taken to the flea market in Japan just weeks before. The memory seemed so far removed from this place, yet the feeling she'd had there, like something was watching, waiting, had returned with her. She remembered the dark corners of the market, where ancient artifacts were piled high, covered in dust. There had been an odd pull towards a certain stall. A stall with the old man who seemed to know more than he let on. He'd hardly spoken, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled her. It wasn't just the strange book he had sold her. It was his expression, as though he had seen something terrible, and he couldn't quite remember what it was, but it haunted him. Sophia had dismissed the thought then, but now, here, in the isolation of the mountain house, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread. She had brought that book with her, the one from the market, the one that seemed to hum with a life of its own. It was still packed away in her bag, unopened. She hadn't dared look at it yet. Not until tonight. But the book was not the only thing she had brought home from the market. There was a lingering presence, a weight on the air. The house was too quiet, and the silence, she realized now, was not a peaceful silence at all. It was a waiting silence, as if something ancient and unseen was just beyond the walls, listening, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Sophia turned away from the window and looked around her room. It felt smaller now, darker. The shadows clung to the corners, deeper than they should be, like they were stretching, pushing in. The house seemed to exhale a low, almost imperceptible groan, as if something inside it had stirred in response to her thoughts. She shook her head and tried to push the feeling away. It was just her imagination, she told herself. She was still adjusting to the new house. It was probably just the isolation getting to her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The land, the house, was too silent. The air was too still. The woods were too dark, and something was calling her. Sophia closed her eyes and reached for the book. That night, as the wind howled through the trees, Sophia's mind drifted back to the moment she first laid eyes on the book. The bustling flea market in Japan had been a far cry from the haunting silence of the mountain house. The bright colors of the stalls, the mingling sounds of vendors and shoppers, the sharp scents of incense and spices had made the place feel alive, vibrant. But the market had also felt wrong in a way. Sophia couldn't place it, but something about that place had stirred an unsettling feeling deep in her chest. The rows of trinkets and antiques, worn by years of handling, seemed innocent enough at first glance. Yet the deeper she ventured into the maze of market stalls, the more she felt like something was watching her. It wasn't just the people, it was the objects themselves. There was something oppressive about them, as if they were more than mere items, each with its own history, its own soul. It had been there, at the back of the market, nestled between some tattered scrolls and weathered statues, that she saw it. The book. A small leather-bound volume, its cover embossed with strange, swirling symbols that looked like they had been carved rather than stamped. The edges of the book were worn, as though it had been handled by countless hands over many years. A dark, faded stain marred the cover, as if it had once been exposed to fire or something far worse. She could still see the old man who had sold it to her, a frail figure bent over his stall, his eyes dark and sunken beneath the heavy folds of his brow. His skin was like parchment, wrinkled and delicate, and his fingers, though trembling, had handed her the book with unsettling care. When she asked about it, his response was brief, almost mechanical. He told her it was from a long time ago, from a place far from the market's vibrant chaos. He couldn't remember where it had come from, or who had owned it before. The old man's voice had dropped to a whisper as he spoke, and his eyes had darted nervously to the people nearby, as if afraid someone might overhear. The few words he offered didn't sit right with her, but she had shrugged it off. The book felt important, like it had been waiting for her. At the time, Sophia didn't know why she bought it. It wasn't as if she needed another old book. It wasn't even the sort of thing she would usually pick up. But when she touched it, a strange pulse seemed to run through her fingertips, and something inside her stirred. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, a call she couldn't resist. Now, back in her room, in the isolated house in the mountains, Sophia couldn't ignore the pull anymore. She opened her bag and retrieved the book, running her fingers over its cover, feeling the intricate carvings beneath her skin. The moment she touched it, the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, stretching along the walls like dark hands reaching for her. Sophia hesitated, staring at the symbols etched into the cover. There was a part of her that felt drawn to it, but another part, deeper and darker, felt an instinctive urge to put it away and never look at it again. She had tried to ignore it at first, but now, sitting in the dim light of her room, it was impossible to escape. The feeling that something was wrong, that something had followed them from Japan, had grown stronger since they arrived in the mountains. It wasn't just the book. It was the land, the house, the air that hung thick with something watching. But what terrified her most wasn't the book itself. It was the way it felt when she held it. It wasn't just an object. It was alive in some way, pulsating with an energy she couldn't explain. Sophia opened the book carefully, the pages stiff and brittle under her fingers. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, as if the book was drawing in the very oxygen around her. She could barely make out the symbols at first, the ink faded and ancient. She thought they were in some foreign language, but as she looked closer, they seemed to shift before her eyes. The shapes twisted and curled, like they were moving on the page, as if the book itself was alive, reacting to her presence. The pattern seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched the beating of her own heart. A cold chill brushed her skin, making her shiver. Something wasn't right. She slammed the book shut, and for a moment, the room felt oddly still. But then the shadows seemed to close in around her once more. The whispers were faint at first, just a murmur, like the rustling of dry leaves. But then the voices grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to come from everywhere at once, from the corners of the room, from beneath the floorboards, from the very walls. They weren't words she could understand, but the tone of them was unmistakable, low, guttural, demanding. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She looked around the room, heart pounding, but saw nothing. The voices were still there, though, filling her head, pushing against her thoughts. Her pulse quickened, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. It was as though the house itself had come alive, its very structure breathing with her. Suddenly, there was a loud crack from the corner of the room, and Sophia whipped her head toward the noise. Her eyes scanned the dark shadows in the room, but there was nothing there, just the eerie stillness of the night. But she could feel it. Something had moved. Something was watching her. The book in her hands seemed heavier now, as if its weight had increased, pulling her toward it. She fought the urge to open it again, but the call was too strong. The shadows, thick and oppressive, reached towards her. A deep, cold breath filled the room. And then, the door to her room creaked open. Sophia froze. Her gaze shifted to the door, but it was empty. The shadows, though, were moving faster now, stretching toward the open door, as if inviting her to follow them. They were alive, the darkness itself, pulling her into their depths. And she knew that somehow, she had already stepped too far into their world. Sophia stood at the door, frozen, her breath shallow and erratic. The book still lay on the bed in front of her, its cover now open, its pages slightly ruffled from her earlier attempt to stop reading. The shadows in the room seemed to grow deeper, more pronounced, as though the dark corners were swelling, expanding outward, pushing against the walls like they were alive. The room itself felt suffocating, as if the house was drawing in a breath with every passing second. She stepped back slowly, her eyes never leaving the door. The wood creaked again, and then, to her horror, the door slowly began to swing shut by itself, as if an invisible hand had gently pushed it closed. She could hear the wind outside howling through the trees, the noise muffled by the walls of the house, but it was the unnatural stillness in the room that made her heart race. She wasn't sure when it had started, but she knew now the room had grown colder. It wasn't the natural chill of mountain air seeping through the walls. This was something deeper, more unnatural. The air was thick, heavier than it should have been. It clung to her skin, seeping into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. Her eyes darted back to the book on the bed. It had shifted. The pages were now open to a different part, one that she hadn't turned to. The symbols on the page seemed to gleam in the dim light, as though they had been drawn with a substance that shimmered faintly. She hadn't turned the pages. She was certain of that. And yet the book was now wide open, as though it had moved of its own accord, showing her something new. Something wanted her to see it. Sophia could feel it in her chest, the pull, the beckoning, the overwhelming desire to reach out and touch the pages once more. It wasn't just curiosity now, it was something primal. Her body seemed to move on its own as her fingers slowly reached for the book, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. The air seemed to hum, vibrating around her as if the very walls were alive with anticipation. When her fingers grazed the paper again, she was no longer aware of the room. She was no longer aware of the house. It felt as though she had entered another world, a world inside the book, where the symbols and shadows merged, where reality and nightmare blended together. The edges of the pages blurred, the ink seeming to swirl, changing shape, as though the very fabric of the book was alive. The whispers started again, louder now, more distinct. They weren't just whispers anymore, they were voices, low and guttural, pressing against her ears, urging her to listen, to follow, to learn. The voices, though muffled, sounded ancient, as though they came from a time long before the mountains, before the land itself. And they all seemed to speak in unison, one voice layered over another. The words, They weren't a language she recognized, but the meaning was clear. It was a command. Sophia felt a sudden shift in the air, like the house had taken a sharp breath. The shadows in the room swirled faster, and she could hear something moving just beyond her reach, something hidden in the corners, watching her with unseen eyes. She spun around, half expecting to see something standing behind her, but there was only the empty room. The darkness pressed in, though, suffocating her, and the whispers grew into something more terrible, more forceful. As the shadows seemed to stretch towards her, the presence in the room grew stronger. It felt like a weight on her chest, a physical pressure that pushed her down, pushing her into the floor beneath her feet. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground in front of the book, unable to resist the compulsion to read. Her fingers trembled as they traced the symbols. And then something shifted. It was as if the house itself groaned in response, the walls creaking with a deep, vibrating sound, like the entire structure of the building was waking up. The darkness seemed to fold in on itself and coalesce into something solid, something alive. The whispers ceased. The room fell into a thick, oppressive silence. In the sudden stillness, Sophia felt the familiar sting of fear that had been gnawing at her since their arrival at the house. But this fear wasn't just from the shadows anymore. It was from the book, from the force it had over her, the way it had woven itself into her thoughts, into her mind. What have I done? A sharp sound broke the silence, like the crack of wood snapping. Sophia looked up quickly, her heart pounding. The door to her room had swung open completely, and she could see a faint sliver of the hallway light spill into the room. The shadows by the door didn't retreat this time. They lingered there, gathered, dense and dark. Sophia slowly pushed herself up, the book still open in her hands. As she stepped toward the door, she felt the air shift. She didn't know why, but she felt as though someone, or something, was standing just beyond the doorway, waiting for her to cross the threshold. The house felt alive now, the walls closing in around her, breathing with her every step. The voices weren't gone. They were just quieter, more insidious, lurking just beneath the surface of her thoughts. As she reached the door, the air grew heavier. Her hands, slick with sweat, gripped the doorframe as she stepped into the hallway. The dim light flickered from the end of the corridor, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally, like they had a life of their own. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. At the far end of the hall, standing just beyond the light, was a figure. Tall, featureless, its form barely distinguishable from the shadows. It moved, but not in the way that a human would. It floated, gliding toward her, its form rippling like a dark wave. Sophia froze, the blood in her veins turning to ice. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised its arm, the fingers extending, elongating unnaturally, as if reaching for her. And just as the figure reached out to touch her, everything went black. The days blurred together in a haze of quiet unease. Though the sun still rose every morning, its light felt weak and distant, failing to lift the heavy, unnatural atmosphere that hung over the house. The mountain air, usually crisp and refreshing, felt thick, suffocating. Every room seemed to pulse with a presence, an invisible weight pressing down on everything within the house. Sophia moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps silent on the worn wooden floors. The house had changed. Where there had once been warmth and familiarity, there was only an oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional groan of the floorboards or the rustling of wind through the trees outside. Her family, too, had changed. Each of them seemed to retreat deeper into themselves, their once strong connections unraveling like thread pulled too tight. Her father's irritability was growing. He snapped at the smallest things, an unwashed dish left in the sink, the way the wind rattled the windows, even the slightest sounds from the house itself. His patience had thinned to the point of breaking. He no longer stayed in one room for long. It was as if he couldn't sit still, as though some unseen force was driving him to keep moving, to never stop. Her brother, Ethan, had become withdrawn. His gaze, once sharp and lively, now appeared clouded, distant. He roamed the house in silence, never acknowledging Sophia when their paths crossed. His steps, once light and full of energy, were now slow, deliberate, like he was searching for something just beyond his reach. It was as if he had lost touch with the present, trapped in a place where the past and future blended into a foggy blur. And then there was their mother. Once the steady, nurturing heart of the family, she had become an empty shell. At times, it was as if she wasn't entirely present, as though her mind had wandered somewhere far away. Her eyes would wander to spots in the room that no one else could see, her gaze distant, unblinking, as if her thoughts were far from the house, far from the family that still lived within it. She no longer spoke as much. When she did, her words had the hollow tone of someone who had forgotten how to truly feel. The house itself, too, seemed to be deteriorating. Its once sturdy structure now creaked and groaned, the floorboards sagging with age and pressure. But it wasn't just the physical decay. There was something more, something unsettling about the way the house seemed to breathe. The air felt stagnant, heavy, like the walls were pressing in from all sides, tightening around them with each passing day. The once peaceful sounds of nature from outside, the rustle of leaves, the chirping of birds, had disappeared, leaving only the eerie silence of the mountains. And sometimes, in the quietest moments, there was a faint sound, as though someone was moving through the walls. Sophia's connection to the house was becoming increasingly distorted. It had been subtle at first, the way she felt drawn to certain parts of the house, places she had never noticed before. The attic, for example. She'd never had a reason to go there, but now it called to her. The narrow staircase that led up to it seemed to beckon her whenever she passed, and though she told herself it was just her imagination, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for her at the top. But whenever she would climb those stairs, the room at the top of the house would be empty, untouched. Still, the air inside would be colder, and the shadows inside the room would stretch longer than they should. It wasn't just the house that was changing, it was her too. She found herself thinking about the book more and more, its dark presence looming over her every waking moment. At first, she had tried to ignore it, to distance herself from its pull, but it had become impossible. Each night, she found herself drawn to it, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover, feeling the pulse of the book beneath her fingertips. The pages, once brittle and stiff, now turned more easily, as if the book had become more pliable, more alive. And with each page she turned, the shadows in the room seemed to grow thicker, as though the darkness itself was alive, waiting. The whispers began to increase in volume, seeping into her thoughts like an invasive current. They were no longer just faint murmurs, they were louder now, more insistent. Though she couldn't understand the language, the tone was unmistakable. It was demanding, urging her to keep reading, to understand the words that swirled on the pages. But there was no answer to the questions that gnawed at her, no sense of clarity, only the need to know more, to open the book further, to uncover the ancient secrets hidden within its pages. One night, after she had closed the book and sat in the darkened room, a cold gust of wind rattled the window. It was so sudden, so violent, that it sent a shiver through her body. She thought for a moment that it was just the wind outside, but then she noticed something far worse. The air inside the room, despite the gust, remained still. The shadows clung to the walls, as though they were drawn inward by some unseen force. And there was a feeling, a sensation, pressing against her skin, as if something were lurking just beyond her sight, waiting for her to notice. She rose slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, and made her way down the hall toward her brother's room. The house seemed to stretch before her, its long corridors now feeling like tunnels, its once familiar rooms now alien, hostile. When she reached his door, she paused. She could feel it, the presence, standing just beyond the door, on the other side. It was as though the house itself had become a living, breathing entity, aware of her every movement. She hesitated, her hand hovering just above the door handle, but a quiet compulsion drew her forward. The door creaked open, and the room was bathed in a dim, cold light. Ethan was sitting on the floor, his back turned, his head tilted slightly to the side, as though he were listening to something only he could hear. His form was unnaturally still. She stepped inside, but as her foot crossed the threshold, a strange, suffocating sensation washed over her. The room felt wrong. She could feel it in her bones, in the air around her. Something had changed in Ethan. His skin, once warm and alive, now felt cold, almost clammy to the touch. His eyes, those once bright, mischievous eyes, were now hollow, as if drained of life. And his movements, when he finally turned to face her, were jerky, unnatural, as though his body was moving against its will. She stepped back, heart pounding, but it was already too late. The room had grown darker, the shadows in the corners now taking on strange, shifting forms. She could feel the walls closing in, suffocating her. The book, still locked in her grip, pulsed with an unnatural energy. The presence, whatever it was, had found her, had found them all. And it was only a matter of time before it claimed them. It was a night like no other, the darkness outside deeper and more oppressive than before. The wind howled through the trees like a chorus of wailing spirits, rattling the windows and pressing against the walls of the house. Sophia couldn't sleep. The shadows in her room seemed to grow taller, stretching across the walls and reaching for her. No matter how hard she tried to ignore it, she could feel the presence closing in. The house was no longer a home, it was a prison, and she could sense the walls tightening around her, squeezing the life out of everything inside. Ethan had been missing for hours. No one had seen him since he wandered into the woods earlier that evening. His disappearance hadn't been alarming at first. He had wandered off before, always coming back. But now, there was an unease hanging over the house. It was as if his absence left a void that the house was eager to fill with darkness. Sophia's parents were in their room, silent, as if they had forgotten how to speak. The house seemed to pull them deeper into itself, each moment that passed making them less human, less connected to the world outside. The air was thick, suffocating, and the silence that filled the space felt heavy, as though it could crush her at any moment. A sudden crash broke the stillness, coming from the attic. It echoed through the house like a thunderclap, sending a jolt through Sophia's body. The sound was too sharp, too violent to be ignored. She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She didn't know why, but she was certain something had found them. Something had crossed over from the shadows and into their world. The feeling of dread grew sharper, colder, until it consumed her. She knew what she had to do. She had to find Ethan. With trembling hands, Sophia reached for the old book. It was still sitting on the table in the living room, just as it had been when she last left it. The pages had turned on their own, and each time she looked at the book, it felt as though the answers were within her grasp, just out of reach. The whispers, once faint, were now deafening, crashing against her mind like a wave. She had read enough. She had uncovered enough of the ancient text to understand the darkness she was dealing with. The house was no longer simply haunted. It was the gateway, the door to another realm, one where the dark spirits, the shadows, could cross into her world. The book, its pages stained and worn with time, was the key. It had chosen her. It had called her to this place. Sophia's body felt light as she walked through the house, the air around her becoming denser with every step. She could hear the sounds of whispers now, low and unintelligible, rising from the walls, from the very ground beneath her feet. As she moved toward the attic door, her hand trembling, she felt an oppressive weight on her chest, as though the very house was trying to force her back. But she pushed forward, ignoring the cold sweat that beaded on her skin. She opened the attic door with a slow, deliberate motion, and the moment it creaked open, the temperature in the house seemed to drop, the air growing impossibly cold. The attic was pitch black, save for the faint moonlight that filtered through the small window at the far side of the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to move, shifting like living things, watching her every move. Then she saw it. Ethan. He was kneeling in the center of the room, his back hunched, his head bent low as though in deep concentration. His body was motionless, unnaturally still, save for the faint twitch of his fingers. The air around him seemed to ripple, like a heat wave rising from the ground. The shadows curled around his form, wrapping themselves around him, feeding off his stillness, drawing him deeper into their grip. Sophia's breath caught in her throat as she approached him. Something was wrong, so wrong. Ethan's body was cold, too cold. His skin was ashen, his eyes closed, and his lips were pale, drawn tight in an expression of agony. It was as if he were caught between two worlds, fighting to remain in one, yet pulled toward the other. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, until it felt as though the very house was screaming at her, urging her to stop, to leave. But she couldn't. Not when she saw her brother, trapped in that state. She stepped forward, reaching out to touch him. The instant her fingers brushed against his shoulder, a violent shock coursed through her, as if her very soul had been torn from her body. She gasped for air, her legs buckling beneath her as an overwhelming force surged through her. A dark shape, as if born of the very shadows, rose from the floor, its form stretching tall and menacing. It was the thing that had haunted the house, the thing that had lured her here, that had fed on her family's fear. It moved like smoke, its edges constantly shifting and flickering, barely defined. The air crackled with its power as it reached out toward her with long, twisting arms. Its presence was suffocating. Its very existence was a mockery of the natural world, a distortion of reality itself. Sophia's mind raced. She had no choice but to fight. She had to do something, anything, to free Ethan, to stop this nightmare from consuming her family, from consuming everything. In a final, desperate act, she opened the book again, her hands trembling as she turned the pages. She didn't know what she was looking for, only that it was somewhere within the dark text. The whispers in her mind had grown so loud that she could no longer distinguish them from her own thoughts. It felt as though the book itself had a life of its own, urging her to read, to speak the words, to make the sacrifice. With no more hesitation, Sophia spoke the words that had been burned into her mind by the book, words in a language older than anything she had known. As she spoke, the shadows recoiled, and the shape shuddered, its form flickering as though the very essence of its being was beginning to unravel. The book's power surged, crashing through the house like a tidal wave. The floor beneath her feet trembled, and the walls groaned in protest. The shadowy figure reached out toward her, its arms now twisting violently as it writhed in pain, but it was too late. The words had already taken hold. With a final, deafening shriek, the entity vanished, its presence dissolving into the air like mist. The shadows retreated, the house fell silent, and the oppressive weight that had hung over them was gone. The room grew warm again, the air lighter. Sophia collapsed beside Ethan, her breath shallow, her limbs shaking. Ethan, once cold and lifeless, began to stir. His body jerked as if waking from a deep, unnatural sleep. He blinked his eyes, his gaze finally focusing on her. But as he looked at her, there was a flicker of recognition, a faint trace of the brother she had known. And then, just as quickly, he looked past her, his expression blank. The house was eerily quiet in the aftermath. The wind had stopped howling, and the oppressive atmosphere that had gripped the family for days seemed to lift. But the weight of what had just occurred lingered like a suffocating fog. Sophia's heart still raced, her body trembling from the immense strain of confronting the entity. But the terror was no longer immediate. It had retreated for now. She glanced at Ethan, who remained motionless beside her. He had not spoken a word since he awoke, and his vacant stare unsettled her more than anything else. His eyes no longer held the warmth or the life they once had. There was an emptiness there, a hollow space where her brother used to be. It wasn't the same. Sophia slowly stood up, her legs weak, and took a few cautious steps away from him. The room around her felt foreign, as though it no longer belonged to her or her family. The wood that had once creaked in a familiar rhythm now groaned under its own weight, as if the house was breathing a sigh of relief, an exhale that felt almost satisfied. The walls that had seemed to close in on them had pulled back, but there was a sense that something still remained, something unfinished. Her eyes moved to the book, still open on the floor, its pages now still. The whispers had quieted, but the silence that followed felt unnatural, an eerie calm that didn't promise safety but rather an uneasy peace. The power of the book had been undeniable, but it wasn't over. She knew that now. The book wasn't just an artifact, it was a conduit, an anchor to something far older and darker. The entity that had risen from the shadows was not gone. It had been driven back, but it still lingered in the air, in the corners of the house, in the depths of her mind. She couldn't explain why, but Sophia knew that the book was now a part of them, woven into the fabric of their existence. It would never truly leave. And if she wasn't careful, if they weren't careful, it would find its way back, through her, or through Ethan, or through someone else entirely. The realization hit her with a cold dread. They hadn't escaped. As she moved toward the stairs to the second floor, her parents stood at the top, their faces pale, eyes wide. They hadn't moved from their room since the entity had first appeared, too paralyzed by fear to act. Now, seeing Sophia and Ethan, they rushed down the stairs, their movements frantic and desperate. But their concern was hollow. There was no warmth in their embrace, no relief in their voices. The darkness had done something to them as well. They were changed, their presence now more like strangers than family. They no longer saw the world the same way. It was as though the entity's influence had seeped into their very souls, and it showed in their vacant eyes and broken expressions. Sophia glanced down at the book in her hands, now closed. The faint pulse from its pages was barely perceptible, but it was there. The dark force had not been entirely eradicated. It had simply receded into the shadows, biding its time. As she stared at the cover of the book, her fingers trembling, she felt an unsettling realization settle within her. The house, the book, the entity, it was all connected. They were all bound together, and no matter how far she went, no matter where they tried to run, the darkness would always follow. Her parents, as though reading her mind, exchanged a glance, their faces void of any expression. It was clear that they too understood this. They had been marked. It wasn't just the house or the book, it was them, all of them. And no matter how much they wanted to believe the worst was behind them, they couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. Ethan, still silent, slowly stood from the floor. His movements were stiff and mechanical, like a puppet whose strings were pulled by invisible hands. He walked toward the door, not glancing at Sophia or anyone else. His face was expressionless, and his footsteps echoed unnervingly in the stillness of the house. It was as though he had become a vessel, a conduit for the evil that had taken root in their lives. Sophia's heart sank as she realized the truth. The entity had never fully possessed him, but it had left its mark. And now, Ethan was nothing more than a hollow shell, a living vessel carrying the dark force within. He was the key, and no matter where he went, no matter how far he wandered, the darkness would follow. He would always find a way back to them. As she stood in the doorway, watching her brother walk away, a sharp chill ran through her veins. The air was growing cold again. It felt like the same suffocating presence that had once filled the house was returning, wrapping itself around them once more. Sophia's gaze shifted to the window, where the distant mountains loomed under the dim light of the moon. The world outside was vast and quiet, but it didn't seem like the same world she had known. It was darker now, its edges blurred, as if the line between the natural and the supernatural had been irrevocably broken. The shadows seemed to reach for her from every corner, and the wind carried with it a low, mournful hum, like a lullaby for the lost. The family, if they could still be called that, had endured the horrors of the house, but it had come at a cost. They were no longer the same. They were bound to the dark forces that had tormented them, tied to an ancient evil that would never truly release its grip. Sophia knew the truth now. The house, the book, the entity, it was all part of a larger web, one that stretched far beyond her understanding. There was no escaping it, no escaping the shadows that would follow them no matter where they went. As she looked at her family, the broken remnants of their once happy life, she understood that the worst was still to come. For some horrors were not confined to one place. They were carried with you, deep inside, gnawing at the edges of your soul, waiting for the right moment to claim you entirely. And in that moment, Sophia realized that the book wasn't just a thing, it was a curse that could never be broken. The house sat in silent anticipation, the wind continuing to whisper its secrets through the trees. The shadows stretched long and dark, creeping across the mountains like tendrils seeking their next victim. Sophia stood at the edge of the darkness, no longer sure what was real and what was a lingering illusion. The book had returned to its place on the shelf, its pages now blank, its power dormant. But Sophia knew better. The story was not over. It had only just begun. The family would move on, or at least try to. They would leave, escape. But no matter where they went, the darkness would always follow. Because some evils never truly die. They are passed down generation after generation, feeding off the fear and the unresolved guilt of those who hold them. And the book would wait. It always waited. As the days passed, the family made the decision to leave. The house was abandoned, its creaking floorboards now silent, the shadows no longer swirling with the same menacing force they once had. The book, with its ancient, unreadable pages, was left behind, left to gather dust in a forgotten corner. Yet, in the hearts of the family, the true horror was far from over. Sophia often found herself staring into the mirror, watching her reflection as though waiting for it to reveal something she could not yet understand. Her eyes, once filled with hope and curiosity, now held a hollow trace of something far older, a darkness that had settled deep within her. It was the same feeling she had once seen in Ethan, when his gaze turned distant, unrecognizable. The terror that had gripped them had not just been a passing nightmare. It had infected them, woven into the very fibers of their being. The truth, Sophia realized, was that the book was never truly an object. It was a vessel. It had been nothing more than a mirror, reflecting the fears, the regrets, and the hidden darkness that each of them carried. It had drawn them into its world, yes, but it had also revealed a deeper, darker truth. There was no escaping the shadows inside themselves. The house was only the beginning. The entity had never truly been the malevolent force they feared. It was a manifestation of their own unresolved guilt and hidden sins, a reflection of everything they had ignored in their lives. The family had unknowingly invited it in, not through the book, but through the cracks in their own souls, the fragments of their broken lives. The book had merely brought it to the surface. As they left the house behind, Sophia's family traveled further into the wilderness, farther from the cursed home. The nights grew colder, darker. The trees that surrounded them were dense and unwelcoming, and the roads seemed to stretch on forever. But no matter how far they went, the unease never left them. It was in the dead of night, under the pale light of the moon, that the first true sign appeared. Sophia's mother, once a warm and nurturing presence, had begun to withdraw into herself. She wandered the house, the same blank stare that Sophia had seen in Ethan now clouding her eyes. Her movements were slow, mechanical, as though she were being guided by something unseen. Her body had become thinner, her face gaunt, as though the life had been drained from her. Ethan too had changed. His silence had deepened, but there was something else, an unsettling, unnatural calm in his demeanor. He no longer walked with the same weight of fear that had once held him captive. Instead, he moved as though he were already a part of the shadow, as though he had become one with the entity that had once tormented them. Sophia watched, helpless, as her family deteriorated before her eyes. The evil, it seemed, had never truly left them. It had merely hidden, biding its time, waiting for the perfect moment to take root once more. And then, one evening, as Sophia sat alone by the window, staring into the darkness beyond, she saw it. It was faint at first, a flicker in the corner of her eye, something just out of reach. But as she turned her gaze, the figure appeared, a shadow moving slowly in the distance, standing tall and unnatural against the trees. It was the entity, not the form she had seen before, but something more refined, more patient, as though it had learned, adapted, and now waited. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. The entity had not followed them, as she had once feared. It had never left. It had merely shifted, its influence not tied to the house or the book, but to something much deeper, something within them all. The twist, the horrifying truth that Sophia now understood, was that the darkness they had fought so hard to escape had never been external. It had always been within them. It had always been part of who they were. The book, the house, the shadows, they were all just catalysts, bringing to light the hidden pieces of their souls. The curse wasn't the house, it was them. The entity was merely a reflection, a shadow of their own flaws and sins that had been growing silently inside them all along. And as Sophia looked into the distance, watching the figure move closer, she realized something even more terrifying. The evil wasn't waiting for them to break. It was waiting for them to join it, to embrace it, because the darkness had been part of them from the very beginning. The family could never escape, because they had never truly been separate from the entity. It had become them. They had become it. As the figure drew nearer, its shape becoming clearer and more familiar, Sophia finally understood. The final twist wasn't that they had been haunted by the shadows. It was that they were the shadows. The entity's true power lay in its ability to make them see their own reflection in it, to make them become it. And now, as the figure reached the edge of the woods, Sophia felt herself step forward, as if the pull of the darkness was not just external, but something that had always been calling to her from within. Her reflection in the glass was no longer just hers. It was them, her family, now bound to the same fate, now indistinguishable from the darkness that had followed them. And as the figure's form melted into the shadows, merging with the night, the last whisper from the book echoed in her mind, no longer a distant murmur, but a voice that felt like her own. We are one. The story ends not with an escape from the horror, but with an unsettling revelation that the darkness was never a force outside of them, but a force that had always resided within, lying dormant until it was awakened. The twist redefines the entire narrative, shifting the reader's understanding of the horror from an external threat to an internal one, leaving the family in a state of irreversible transformation. The true terror of the story lies in the idea that we are not just haunted by our past or by forces we can't control, but that we are also haunted by the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. The unresolved mystery of the entity and the lingering presence of the shadows suggest that the family's suffering is cyclical and unending, a pattern that will repeat across generations, as they are forever tied to the darkness that defines them. In this way, the curse is not something that can be escaped. It is something they must live with until it consumes them entirely.